Brought to you by Penguin.
The Signal and the Noise by Nate Silver. Read by Mike Chamberlain.
Preface to the 2020 edition. We were warned, and it didn't really make much difference. In 2015, Bill Gates said that a pandemic was more likely to kill millions of people than a war. In 2016, after Donald Trump won the presidency, an event about which we'll have more to say later, President Obama's transition team left behind a playbook dealing with responses to a number of pandemic scenarios, including a novel coronavirus. In 2019, Dr. Anthony Fauci cited a respiratory pandemic like SARS, that is, something exactly like COVID-19, in response to a reporter's question of what kept him up at night. To be clear, these predictions weren't terribly specific. Nobody said, a novel coronavirus will originate in winter of 2019 to 20 in Wuhan, China. None of these people were clairvoyant. But they attested that the background risk was fairly high. On average, there has been a severe pandemic around every 50 years in the U.S. The last two major ones before COVID-19 were influenza pandemics in 1918 to 19 and 1957 to 58, which might imply around a 2% annual chance. If such a pandemic killed the same proportion of Americans as died in the 1918 to 19 pandemic, or around 0.7% of the population, that would result in 2.3 million deaths. Take 2% of 2.3 million, and you wind up with 46,000 deaths per year, or more than 10 times as many people as died in the September 11th attacks. That's why people like Gates and Fauci were worried. It's harder to say exactly when COVID-19 specifically became such an acute threat. As late as mid-February, a super forecasting panel, a project led by Phil Tetlock, whom you'll meet in Chapter 2, and which generally has made successful forecasts, assigned only a 3% chance to the pandemic being as bad as it would turn out to be a month later. And there were plenty of experts, even Dr. Fauci, who downplayed the threat to the U.S. at times. But as outbreaks began to flare in Italy and other countries, the situation was getting worse quickly. By February 25th, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention had ominously warned Americans that they should prepare for significant disruptions in their daily lives. And epidemiologists like Harvard's Mark Lipsitch were predicting that 40 to 70% of the world's population would eventually be infected with the coronavirus. And yet, it would be almost 4 weeks before California became the first state to issue a statewide stay-at-home order on March 19th. I'm sorry for the cliché, but those days literally felt like the calm before the storm. You find yourself watching the storm clouds gather, hearing the first claps of thunder, recognizing the inevitability of what's about to come. But you don't know how bad it's going to be, and you feel helpless to do anything about it. I remember going to dinner at the MIT Sloan Sports Analytics Conference in Boston in early March with a smart group of people, sports executives, star athletes, academics, venture capital investors, a U.S. congressman, and several of the people you'll meet in this book. It would have been ironic if these people, most of whom, in some form or another, are paid to assess risk and uncertainty, had been ignorant of the coronavirus threat. But we were pretty worried. We all had the sense that this was the last time in a while that there might be this sort of get-together. Did any of us actually do anything about it, though? Not really. It's not even clear that the conference should have been held in the first place. A Biogen conference in Boston a week earlier had turned out to be a super-spreader event. I remember returning to New York City after the conference, and Mayor Bill de Blasio telling people to avoid using the subway. Those of you who don't live in New York might not grasp quite how vital the subway is. Telling a New Yorker to avoid the subway is like telling a fish to avoid
Sample complete. Ready to continue?